Picture this. You're a German soldier who's been told America is weak, barely holding on, struggling to even feed its own people. Then you land on American soil as a prisoner of war and see something that makes your brain short-circuit. Grocery stores packed with food, factories that never sleep, regular families driving their own cars. Everything you were told was a lie. Between 1942 and 1945, over 370,000 German prisoners of war ended up in camps scattered across the United States. These weren't just any soldiers, many were hardcore believers in Nazi propaganda who genuinely thought Germany was fighting against a nation on the verge of collapse. But the moment they arrived, something happened that Nazi Germany never prepared them for. They saw the truth, and that truth shattered everything they thought they knew about America's power. What they witnessed changed not just the war, but many of these men for the rest of their lives. This is the story of how German POWs discovered America's real secret weapon and why that discovery terrified them more than any battle ever could. Let's go back to understand what these German soldiers actually believed before they ever set foot in America. Nazi propaganda had spent years painting a very specific picture of the United States. According to Joseph Goebbels and the entire German propaganda machine, America was a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing, controlled by Jewish bankers, and filled with lazy workers who couldn't compete with the pure Aryan productivity of German industry. German soldiers were told that American civilians were starving, that the Great Depression had never really ended, that America's entry into the war was a desperate last gasp of a dying empire. The propaganda films showed breadlines, unemployment, and social chaos. They were taught that one superior German worker could outproduce 10 lazy Americans. And here's the thing, many of them believed it completely. Why wouldn't they? Germany had built an incredibly powerful military machine. By 1941, they had conquered most of Europe. Their tanks were feared. Their submarines controlled vast stretches of the Atlantic. Their industry was pumping out weapons at a rate that seemed unstoppable. When German soldiers fought Americans in North Africa, Italy, or later in France, they often held their own, or even won battles. The propaganda reinforced itself. See, we're superior, we're winning. But there was a massive problem with this worldview. The German soldiers saw only tiny pieces of the puzzle. They fought individual battles. They never saw the bigger picture. They had no idea what was happening back in America. No concept of the industrial machine that was gearing up across the ocean. The German high command knew better. Generals like Erwin Rommel and even some of Hitler's advisors understood that American industrial capacity was a serious threat. But this information never filtered down to regular soldiers. They were kept in the dark-fed, steady doses of propaganda that assured them victory was certain. So when these men were captured in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, or Germany itself, they were still confident, still believers. Many actually felt relieved to be out of the fighting, but certain that Germany would ultimately win the war. Then they boarded ships headed for America, and that's when their entire world started to crack. The trip across the Atlantic Ocean was the first hint that something wasn't quite right with the propaganda narrative. German U-boats, the famous submarines that had terrorized Allied shipping for years, were supposed to control these waters. German POWs expected to see signs of struggle. They expected convoys to be under constant attack. They expected the crossing to be dangerous and difficult. Instead, they sailed in ships that were part of massive convoys, ships everywhere, destroyers, escort carriers, supply vessels. The ocean was thick with Allied naval power, and German submarines mostly absent, or if they attacked, they were hunted down quickly by American anti-submarine warfare that had become brutally efficient. The prisoners watched this from the decks. They started doing math in their heads. How many ships was America building to have this many just for transport? Where were the successful U-boat attacks they'd heard about in propaganda broadcasts? Some of the more observant POWs began to suspect they'd been lied to, but most still held onto their beliefs. Maybe this was just one lucky convoy. Maybe the U-boats were focused elsewhere. Maybe American propaganda was working on them already. Then they arrived at American ports, New York, Boston, Norfolk, and the real shock began. Imagine you're Hans Schmidt, a 24-year-old German soldier from a small town outside Munich. You've been told America is struggling, weak, on the verge of economic collapse. You step off the ship onto American soil, and you see something your brain can't process. The ports are absolutely massive, not just big, massive in a way that doesn't make sense. There are more ships being loaded and unloaded in a single day than you've seen in your entire life. Cranes everywhere, mountains of supplies, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, all lined up ready for shipping. And the speed, everything moves with mechanical precision. Forklifts zip around, train cars roll in and out constantly. Ships are loaded in hours, not days. The whole operation runs like a machine that never stops. One German officer, Karl von Bergen, later wrote in his diary, "I stood there watching for 3 hours. I counted over 200 cargo trucks. Then I stopped counting. I realized I was watching just one small section of one port. How many ports does America have? How is this possible?" The POWs were transported inland by train, and this is where the real education began. The train rides from the coasts to POW camps in the interior became almost legendary among German prisoners. These journeys, sometimes lasting several days, gave them a rolling panorama of American industrial and agricultural might. Picture being on a train passing through Pennsylvania. You look out of the window and see steel mills, not one or two, dozens, stretched out for miles, smokestacks everywhere running day and night. The sky glows orange from the furnaces. You can see the heat shimmer even from a distance. One POW later recalled, "I thought Essen was impressive. I thought the Ruhr Valley was the industrial heart of the world. Then I saw Pittsburgh. It made German industry look like a blacksmith shop. The trains would pass through Ohio, and the prisoners would see factory after factory, rubber plants, tire manufacturers, machine shops, aircraft component facilities, every single one running at full capacity, multiple shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But here's what really broke their brains: the farms. As the trains crossed the Midwest, German POWs saw American agriculture on a scale they couldn't comprehend, fields stretching to the horizon, not small family plots like back home. Industrial-scale farming with machines they'd never seen before, combines that could harvest more wheat in an hour than a German farmer could in a week, tractors everywhere, irrigation systems that looked more advanced than German military equipment, grain silos that could hold enough food to feed an entire German city. Wolfgang Fischer, a Luftwaffe pilot who was shot down over England and eventually sent to a camp in Kansas, described his reaction. "I looked out at the wheat fields and realized Germany could never win this war. We were rationing bread. We were told America was starving. I was looking at enough grain to feed all of Europe. And this was just Kansas. How many states does America have again? 48? The trains would stop at small town stations, and even these tiny American towns shocked the German prisoners. German propaganda had painted American civilians as desperate and struggling. The prisoners expected to see poverty, bread lines, misery. Instead, they saw ordinary American life, and it was nothing like what they'd been told. At train stops, local Americans would sometimes gather to look at the prisoners, not with hatred, surprisingly, but with curiosity. The POWs noticed something immediately. These regular American civilians looked well-fed. Actually, they looked more than well-fed. Many were overweight by German standards. Their clothes weren't patched and reused like German civilian clothes back home. They looked new, clean, mass-produced. People wore different outfits. They had options. And the cars. So many cars. In Germany, private automobile ownership was rare. Cars were luxury items. The average German worker might never own a car in their lifetime. The Volkswagen, the people's car, was more propaganda than reality for most Germans. But in these small American towns, almost every family had a car, sometimes two. They weren't fancy cars, necessarily. They were practical, mass-produced vehicles, Fords, Chevrolets, cars that looked like they were built for regular people, not the wealthy elite. One POW from a camp in Texas later said, "The thing that shocked me most wasn't the big cities or the factories. It was seeing a farm worker, a man who worked with his hands in the dirt, drive away in his own automobile. In Germany, that man would be lucky to have a bicycle." The prisoners noticed gas stations everywhere. America wasn't rationing fuel the way Germany was. People drove wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. For a nation supposedly on the brink of collapse, Americans seemed to have a lot of freedom and a lot of resources. But the real mind-blowing experience came when the POWs actually arrived at their camps and started living day-to-day life as prisoners in America. The conditions in American POW camps were covered by the Geneva Convention, which America actually followed. This alone was shocking to many German soldiers who had heard stories about how prisoners were treated on the Eastern Front, but it went beyond just following the rules. The Americans had resources to spare. Let's talk about food first, because this became the most talked about topic among German POWs. The prisoners were fed according to the same rations as American soldiers, not less, the same. This meant 3 full meals a day, meat regularly, fresh vegetables, bread that wasn't mixed with sawdust or potato starch to stretch the flour supply, real coffee, milk. German soldiers, even those who had been fighting on the Western Front, hadn't eaten this well in years. The Wehrmacht had been dealing with supply problems since at least 1942. Rations had been cut. Quality had declined. Soldiers supplemented their diet with whatever they could forage or steal from occupied territories. Now, as prisoners, they were eating better than they had as soldiers, better than their families back home in Germany, who were dealing with severe rationing and shortages. Heinz Werner, a tank commander captured in France, wrote to his family, "I know this will sound strange, but I am healthier now than when I was fighting. We have enough food, real butter, fresh milk. I have gained weight. Please do not worry about me." But the food was just the beginning. The POWs noticed that even the waste in American camps was shocking. Kitchen scraps that would have been carefully saved and reused in Germany were thrown away. Bread that was a day old was tossed. Partially eaten meals went into trash bins without a second thought. To German soldiers who had been taught to save every crumb, this casual waste was almost offensive. It spoke to a level of abundance they couldn't grasp. The camps themselves were well built, barracks with electricity, running water, toilets that flushed, showers with hot water, medical care that was prompt and competent, camp hospitals with actual medicines and supplies. Remember, many of these men had been fighting in brutal conditions, frozen trenches in Russia, desert heat in North Africa, bombed out cities in Italy. They'd seen their comrades die from infections that could have been prevented with basic antibiotics. They'd gone weeks without a proper shower or clean water. Now they were prisoners, and they had better living conditions than they'd had as soldiers fighting for Germany. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be assigned to work as long as it wasn't directly supporting the war effort. So German prisoners were put to work on farms, in food processing plants, in lumber camps, and on various labor projects. This is where they got a front-row seat to American productivity and work methods. German POWs who worked on American farms were stunned by the mechanization. They saw operations with maybe 2 or 3 workers managing hundreds of acres using tractors, combines, and other machinery. In Germany, the same acreage would require dozens of workers using more primitive tools. One former POW described working in a tomato canning facility in California. The conveyor belts never stopped. The machines sorted, washed, cut, cooked and canned tomatoes faster than I could count. 10 German workers with hand tools could not do what one machine did in this place, and they had dozens of these machines. The American workers they met were also different from what propaganda had described. They weren't lazy, they weren't incompetent, they were well trained, efficient, and worked with equipment that made their jobs faster and easier. German POWs noticed something else. American workers were paid well. They had unions. They had safety standards. They took breaks. They worked 8-hour shifts, not 12 or 14, and yet they produced more per person than German workers who were being pushed to their absolute limits. This challenged a fundamental Nazi belief that German discipline and racial superiority made them more productive than inferior Americans. But the evidence was right in front of them. American workers, in better conditions, with better equipment, were dramatically more productive. Fritz Engelmann, who worked in a lumber camp in Oregon, said it plainly. "We worked hard in Germany because we had to. Americans work smart because they have the tools and the training. I thought we were the advanced nation. I was wrong." Another shock came from access to information. In the POW camps, German prisoners were allowed to read American newspapers and magazines. They could listen to the radio. They could see newsreels. And what they saw completely contradicted everything German propaganda had told them. They read about American industrial production numbers. The United States was building 1 ship per day. Actually, at peak production, it was more than 1 ship per day. Liberty ships were being built in some shipyards in less than 2 weeks from keel to launch. German POWs saw the numbers and thought they were propaganda. American. Propaganda inflating the numbers to damage German morale. So they started checking. They compared reports from different newspapers. They asked American guards. They looked for evidence that the numbers were fake. The numbers were real. America was producing war materials at a rate that was physically impossible by German standards. But it was happening. They read about aircraft production. America was building planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, at its peak, produced about 40,000 in a year, and that required stripping resources from every other part of the economy. The prisoners saw photos of American factories with thousands of workers assembling bombers on production lines that stretched to the length of football fields. They saw aerial photos of tank depots with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of Sherman tanks lined up ready for shipping. Kurt Vonnegut, who would later become a famous American author, was a German-American soldier captured at the Battle of the Bulge and held in a POW camp. He described German prisoners reading American magazines. They would sit there looking at advertisements for washing machines, refrigerators, new cars. These were consumer goods. During a war, Americans were buying washing machines while fighting a two-front war. The Germans couldn't understand it, and that was another thing that broke their understanding. The American economy was producing massive amounts of war material while still maintaining civilian production, still making cars for civilian use, still making appliances, still keeping stores stocked with food and consumer goods. Germany had converted its entire economy to total war. Everything was for the military. Civilians sacrificed everything, and Germany still couldn't match American production. The relationships between German POWs and American guards and civilians are worth examining, because they revealed another layer of American society that propaganda had completely misrepresented. Nazi propaganda portrayed Americans as racially mixed, culturally inferior, and socially chaotic. It emphasized racial tensions and suggested American society was on the verge of collapse. But German POWs found something different. They met American soldiers who were professional and fair, not cruel, not sadistic. They followed rules. They treated prisoners with a level of respect that was surprising. Many American guards were friendly. They would talk with the prisoners, share cigarettes, show photos of their families. Some POWs formed genuine friendships with their guards. This was confusing for prisoners who had been taught that Americans were their mortal enemies. How could these ordinary American men who treated them decently be the villains German propaganda described? German POWs also noticed the diversity of American guards. There were men of different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different religions, working together, following the same rules, respecting the same chain of command. Some camps were in the South, and POWs witnessed racial segregation between black and white Americans. Nazi propaganda had talked about American racism as proof of America's moral inferiority. Some POWs expected this to cause chaos and weakness. Instead, they saw something that confused them even more. Despite segregation, despite clear racial problems, American society still functioned, still produced, still fought effectively. The racial issues existed, but they didn't prevent America from being powerful. In fact, some German POWs were treated better than African American soldiers in certain parts of America during this time. This was uncomfortable for everyone involved and highlighted the deep contradictions in American society. But here's what the German POWs took away from this. America was powerful despite its problems, not because it was perfect. The Nazi propaganda had said America's diversity made it weak. The prisoners saw that America's strength came from something else, from its resources, its industry, its systems. Heinrich Böll, who later became a Nobel Prize-winning author, was a German soldier who spent time in American captivity. He wrote, "We were taught that America's freedom was a weakness, that their democracy made them soft, but I saw that their freedom made them strong. Men wanted to work because they benefited from their work. They wanted to fight because they believed in what they were fighting for. We fought because we were ordered to." There is a difference. For many German POWs, there came a moment, a specific point where the cognitive dissonance became too much, where they could no longer reconcile Nazi propaganda with what they were witnessing. For some, it was seeing grocery stores. POW work details would sometimes pass through towns. The prisoners would see American supermarkets through windows or open doors, shelves packed with food, meat departments with fresh cuts, produce sections overflowing with vegetables and fruits, all available to any American with money to buy it. They remembered German ration cards, standing in line for hours for a small piece of meat, bread mixed with fillers because flour was scarce, families going hungry, and here in America food was abundant, casual, normal. For others, it was the realization about industrial scale. A POW working in a factory might learn that the facility he was working in was just one of many identical facilities spread across the country, all producing the same items, all running at full capacity. The redundancy, the backup systems, the sheer scale of American production made German industry look small by comparison. For some, it was simpler. It was watching American families on Sunday drives, happy, well-fed, living normal lives while their country was fighting a war on two fronts across two oceans, supplying multiple allied nations and still maintaining civilian comfort. Germany had thrown everything into the war effort, every resource, every person. The whole nation was mobilized for war, and it still wasn't enough. America seemed to be fighting the war with one hand while maintaining normal life with the other, and winning. Otto Giese, a submariner captured in 1945, described his breaking point. "I was walking through a small town in Mississippi on a work detail. I saw a black American man, someone Nazi propaganda told me was racially inferior to Germans, driving a truck full of supplies. His truck was newer and better maintained than any vehicle I had seen in the German military in the last 2 years of the war. In that moment, I understood. We had been lied to about everything." Let's talk numbers for a moment because the statistics are almost unbelievable. During World War II, American industry produced approximately 300,000 aircraft. Germany produced about 119,000 total during the entire war. America built 88,000 tanks. Germany built about 67,000 total, and that's counting every model. American shipyards launched nearly 5,200 major vessels during the war. Germany, at its peak, was building U-boats in underground facilities using slave labor and still couldn't keep up with the rate at which America was sinking them and replacing Allied ships. America produced 41 billion rounds of ammunition. That's billion with a B. German ammunition production, while substantial, was a fraction of that. American factories made 2.4 million trucks and jeeps. These vehicles became famous worldwide. German soldiers actually preferred captured American trucks to their own vehicles because American trucks were more reliable, easier to repair, and more capable. The United States also supplied massive amounts of material to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. This included over 400,000 trucks, 7,000 tanks, 11,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of food, fuel, and supplies. Think about that. America was supplying another nation fighting on a third front while still maintaining its own military and civilian economy. German POWs, when they learned these numbers, often refused to believe them at first. The numbers seemed impossible, but the evidence was everywhere. They saw the factories, they saw the equipment, they worked alongside the production. To understand the shock German POWs felt, you need to understand what was happening in Germany during this same period. By 1943, German cities were being bombed around the clock. The British bombed at night. The Americans bombed during the day. German industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed. German civilians were starving. Ration cards provided barely enough calories to survive. There was no fresh fruit, little meat. Bread was adulterated with anything that could stretch the flour supply. German factories were desperate for workers. They used slave labor from concentration camps. They forced foreign workers from occupied territories to work in German industry. They conscripted everyone who could hold a tool. German production was falling. Raw materials were scarce. Transportation networks were disrupted by bombing. The economy was collapsing under the weight of total war mobilization combined with strategic bombing. And here were German soldiers, now prisoners in America, eating 3 meals a day, living in heated barracks, working with modern equipment, seeing American civilians with cars and washing machines and full refrigerators. The contrast was absolutely stark. It was impossible to ignore. Some POWs wrote letters home, not many, because mail was censored and slow. But some tried to tell their families what they were seeing. They tried to explain that Germany couldn't win, that America was too powerful, that the propaganda had been lies. Many of these letters were never sent. Camp officials and German officers still loyal to the Nazi cause in the camps would prevent such defeatist messages from leaving. But the POWs talked among themselves, and a shift started happening. Not all German POWs changed their minds. Some remained committed Nazis throughout their captivity, and even after returning to Germany, they dismissed what they saw as propaganda. They convinced themselves that American abundance was temporary or fake. But many, probably most, went through a transformation. At first, denial. This is just one rich area. The rest of America must be struggling. Then doubt. Maybe some of the propaganda was exaggerated. Then acceptance. We were lied to. Germany cannot win this war. And finally, for many, a complete rejection of Nazi ideology. If they lied about America, what else did they lie about? This transformation happened at different speeds for different men. Some figured it out during the train ride across America. Others took months in the camps. Some only accepted it after Germany surrendered and they learned about the Holocaust and the full extent of Nazi crimes. Camps had internal political divisions, hardcore Nazis who refused to accept reality, moderate prisoners who were questioning everything, anti-Nazi prisoners who had always opposed Hitler but been forced to fight anyway. There were even incidents of violence in some camps between these groups. Nazi true believers would attack prisoners who spoke openly about Germany losing the war. They would enforce loyalty oaths. They would report traitors to camp commanders. But over time, as the war news got worse for Germany, as more prisoners arrived with stories of defeats and retreats, the hardliners lost influence. Reality became impossible to deny. The real climax of this story came in two phases, one collective, one individual. The collective climax was May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. In POW camps across America, German prisoners heard the news. For many, it was a moment of crushing defeat mixed with relief. The war was over. They had survived, but their nation had been utterly defeated. Camp commanders made sure POWs heard the news broadcasts, saw the photographs of destroyed German cities, learned about the occupation. Many POWs also learned for the first time about the Holocaust, about the concentration camps, about the systematic murder of millions. This was beyond shocking. Many refused to believe it at first. This had to be Allied propaganda, atrocity stories made up to justify the war. But the evidence kept coming: photographs, testimony, film footage. Some camps actually showed POWs documentary footage of liberated concentration camps. The reaction was visceral. Some men vomited, some cried, some sat in stunned silence. The combination of Germany's total military defeat and the revelation of Nazi atrocities caused a complete psychological collapse for many POWs. Everything they had believed was wrong. Everything they had fought for was evil. Their entire worldview crumbled. Heinrich Böll described it. "We sat in that room watching the footage from Bergen-Belsen. No one spoke. What could you say? We had defended this. We had believed in this system. We had called to this patriotism. God forgive us." But there's another climax. The individual one. The moment each prisoner made a choice about who they would be after all this. Some German POWs chose to learn, to understand, to change. They attended educational programs that American authorities set up. They learned about democracy, about freedom, about responsibility. They read banned books. They had discussions with American educators who were brought in to help with denazification. These men decided that when they returned to Germany, they would help rebuild it as something different, something better. And many of them did exactly that. Former POWs who spent time in America became important figures in post-war West Germany. They became politicians, businessmen, educators. They brought back ideas about democracy, capitalism, and industrial efficiency that helped Germany recover and eventually thrive. Others chose different paths. Some couldn't face what they had learned. They retreated into bitterness or denial. Some committed suicide. Some became broken men who never recovered from the psychological trauma of seeing their entire belief system destroyed. But here's the key moment, the real climax of this story. The moment when a German prisoner of war, sitting in a camp in Kansas or Texas or Pennsylvania, looked around at American abundance and American power and realized that his nation had been defeated not by cruelty or oppression, but by industry, organization, and freedom. That moment, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of camps over several years, represented a fundamental shift, a breaking point. The moment when Nazi propaganda finally died, not because someone argued against it, but because reality made it impossible to sustain. The story of German POWs in America is more than just an interesting historical footnote. It's a lesson about propaganda, reality, and the power of seeing truth with your own eyes. These men arrived in America expecting to find a weak, divided, failing nation. Instead, they found an industrial superpower that was fighting a war on three fronts while still maintaining a standard of living that Germany had never achieved even in peacetime. The shock of this discovery changed many of these men permanently. They returned to Germany with stories about American abundance, about factories that dwarfed anything in Europe, about ordinary workers who owned cars and lived in comfortable houses, about a system that, despite its flaws, produced results that spoke for themselves. Some historians argue that these returned POWs played an important role in shaping West Germany's post-war development. They had seen firsthand how American industrial capitalism worked. They understood the importance of productivity, efficiency, and modern manufacturing methods. They brought back not just stories, but ideas about how to organize an economy and a society. The American military authorities understood this potential. That's partly why POWs were treated well and given opportunities to see American life. It was strategic. Show them what's possible, show them an alternative to totalitarianism. Hope that they take those lessons back home. Did it work? In many cases, yes. West Germany became a democratic, prosperous nation closely aligned with the United States. Former POWs were part of that transformation. But the deeper lesson is about the power of propaganda versus reality. Nazi propaganda was sophisticated. It was effective. It convinced an entire nation of lies that seemed believable within the closed information system of Nazi Germany. But propaganda, no matter how sophisticated, cannot survive contact with reality. When German POWs saw America with their own eyes, when they lived among American civilians, worked in American facilities, ate American food, the propaganda collapsed. You cannot convince someone that a nation is weak when they're watching that nation produce war materials at an impossible rate. You cannot convince someone that people are starving when grocery stores are packed with food. You cannot convince someone that an economy is failing when everyone has a car and a house. Reality has a way of asserting itself. Truth eventually becomes impossible to deny. The German POWs who came to America received an education they never expected, not just about American industrial might, but about the cost of believing comfortable lies instead of facing uncomfortable truths. Many of them spent the rest of their lives telling their stories, trying to explain to younger Germans what it was like to believe so completely in something, only to have that belief shattered by reality, trying to pass on the lesson that propaganda, no matter how appealing, must be questioned. That truth matters. That reality always wins in the end. Their experience stands as a reminder to all of us. Be skeptical of information that seems too convenient. Be wary of narratives that paint complex situations in simple black and white. Be willing to change your mind when evidence contradicts your beliefs, because somewhere there's always a train ride across America waiting to shatter your assumptions. There's always reality ready to prove propaganda wrong. The question is whether you're willing to see it, accept it, and learn from it. The German POWs who transformed their understanding didn't do so because they were weak or disloyal. They did so because they were strong enough to face the truth and honest enough to admit they had been wrong. That takes a different kind of courage than fighting a war, maybe a more important kind. Subscribe if you want more history that challenges what you think you know.